If you're going to make something for a specific audience, the worst thing you can do is compromise and make concessions to those who are not the target audience in the name of fairness. Tell them to leave and find what they want somewhere else.
Still using all the muscles except the one that matters.
I saw this comment on Twitter, and it was similar to something that had been on my mind ever since Tim Sheridan released that video claiming he's trying to own Comicsgate. To repeat the comment, quote, "If you're making something for a specific audience, the worst thing you can do is compromise and make concessions to those who are not the target audience in the name of fairness. Tell them to leave and find what they want somewhere else."
How about new?
I get where this person is coming from, but it reminds me of a lesson I learned back in college. When I got to pick my classes, I signed up for Introduction to Fiction Writing as soon as I could. I jumped at the chance to finally get people other than my friends to read my work. They liked my stuff and I didn't think they were lying to me, but I wanted critical feedback. So I typed out some stories, took them to class, had them read by the other students, waited for the recall session where you talk about what worked for you in the story, and bupkis. Crickets. Not a word. They could not have been less interested. Part of that was my fault. I started the scenes midway through the story, so no one had any clue what was happening. Who were these people? Why did they have powers? Why were they fighting? Why was Ragnarok happening in the middle of Chicago? None of that explained. I just dropped people into the middle of the last fight in Avengers Endgame. That was a stupid thing to do, and I learned a lesson. The other part, though, was that the class didn't like sci-fi or fantasy. In fact, most of the students in the department didn't like sci-fi or fantasy. They were into slice-of-life dramas, edgelord drug stories, and the occasional comedy. Throw a dragon or superpowers into the mix, though, and they just tap out. And this wasn't just for the hardcore world-building stuff. The tiniest amount of sci-fi or fantasy would result in dead silence. And this wasn't just for my stories. There were about 2 or 3 other sci-fi fantasy writers in the class, and they got the same reaction. There I was trying to improve as a writer, and I couldn't get any feedback. So I did the only thing that seemed reasonable. I wrote slice-of-life stories. I had some stories that were like that anyway, and those stories got a great reaction and plenty of feedback. And I wasn't the only one who did this. Other sci-fi and fantasy writers did the same thing and got the same response. That told me the problem wasn't our writing. It was the genres we chose. We were dealing with people who simply didn't like sci-fi or fantasy stories. The problem was, that's what I wanted to write. I like those genres. My favorite stories come from those genres. It's what I do, and I didn't want to give that up just to get a response. Sure, I could write more than one story at once, but the idea of not getting feedback on the stories I poured all my energy and passion to bothered me. I wasn't willing to set those stories aside, so when the only thing I worked on for that week was a sci-fi or fantasy story, that's what I turned into class, knowing full well that I wouldn't get much of a reaction. I had to be true to myself and the stories I wanted to tell, instead of trying to compromise the story just to get feedback. Now, I would love to say that eventually people's attitudes changed, but that would be a lie. I took fiction writing classes every semester, and outside of the one fantasy writing course I took, I kept getting the same disinterested response. To be fair though, the teachers were much more supportive. In fact, my first teacher called me several times to make sure I signed up for fiction writing classes. And my third teacher tried submitting one of my stories for the school's annual short story anthology, but they don't publish fantasy. This was a valuable lesson because it taught me how to deal with people who didn't like my work. I could get angry about it, but that wouldn't change that they just weren't interested, and there really wasn't anything I could do about that. The only thing I could do was tell the story I wanted to tell and trust that I did it in a way that the people who didn't mind or actually liked that genre would enjoy it. I had to take the attitude that if people didn't respond, then these stories just weren't for them, and then move on. After taking classes for years, I wound up in classes with some of the same people again, so even if they didn't like the genres, they knew I would eventually write sci-fi and fantasy stuff, and those people were more likely to give feedback. Eventually, I did find some people who liked those genres, but when it came to the others who didn't, my attitude was, okay, guess it's not for you. And that brings us back to the original comment. I totally agree with the first part. You shouldn't compromise your story to try to appeal to people who aren't interested in what you're doing. If you do, the story's probably not going to turn out well. You'd really have no idea what or how much you'd have to change, and you're probably not going to be happy with the final result. Obviously, this isn't set in stone. Sometimes compromising helps the story or at least gets it over with the audience. The change to the ending of Little Shop of Horrors is a great example of this. The original ending had the plants taking over the world, but the test audience hated it, so it got scrapped, which meant throwing out 15 minutes of some of the best special effects work I've ever seen. That change makes sense. But if it's changing it in a way that doesn't serve the story, or to play politics, or to just do it, yeah, I'm against that. The story knows where it wants to go. It doesn't need help from someone shouting directions half a mile away. That said, I don't agree with telling people to go away and find what they want somewhere else. That's not going to make them like your story. Actually, it'll have the opposite effect. Now they won't want to have anything to do with your story or you. Don't take my word for it. Just ask Kelly Sue, if you don't like my politics, don't buy my books, DeConnick. How'd that work out for her? Better yet, how'd it work out for Tim Sheridan? Oh, that's right. Nobody buys their books. When you have this preemptive attitude of, this isn't for you, it comes across as if you're attacking people for not liking your work. Now, there is a difference between doing that and reacting to someone copping an attitude about your work. You get some leeway if people are badgering you to tell the story the way they want you to, or if they're trying to stop you from telling stories they don't like. If you tell a story that some people won't like and they come at you, I think it's perfectly fine to say, okay, I guess it's not for you. Because it's true. That's what they just told you. But in general, lose the attitude. You can acknowledge that your work won't appeal to them without doing it in the douchiest way possible. I know it feels good, but they kind of have to earn it. You can't just start with that. You can be more generous than tell them to leave and find what they want somewhere else. And honestly, if you really wanted to get under their skin, just go, okay, whatever. That'll piss them off way more than insulting them. And no, that's totally not a thing I learned from experience. She was mad. She was so mad. 20 years later, I bet she's still mad. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.